So we'll have a discussion running perhaps 45 minutes or closer to an hour. I want to leave time for questions from the audience. When you do have questions, and please make sure they're questions, not speeches, we have a microphone at the bottom of each aisle. You'll need to actually speak into the microphone to be recorded. I'd like to start with you, Dana. Your series, Top Secret America, an absolutely chilling description of a kind of national security concerns and bureaucracy run amok. I think you said that, tapping into the funds released after 9/11, there's something like 1,271 government organizations and 1,931 private companies working on counterterrorism or related things. You and William Arkin, the co-writer, took 2 years to gather all this material. How did you get the idea for it? And how did you go about assembling all that information?
Well, briefly, I'd covered intelligence and the military after 9/11. And when we got done trying to figure out what had happened on 9/11, who Al-Qaeda was, we eventually started saying, well, what's the government doing? What is the government doing to try to fight this war that was now called the Global War on Terrorism? And unlike the military, which is a relatively open organization compared to the intelligence world, you couldn't find out because it was all classified. All of it was classified. So, that's the secrecy veil that we were up against. But managed to write about the CIA for many years and other parts of it. And then at a certain point, Bill and I, who have been colleagues for a long time, just on the phone talking a lot about what we're seeing and what do you think it is and that sort of thing, said, there's something that's going on here that's very big. And it's structural, it's probably permanent. I could feel it wherever I was, the number of organizations, the proliferation of code names, of slang for this and that, the units. Well, why don't we try to figure out how to map it? And how to describe a huge thing, which was big because the military is large and there are 18 intelligence agencies within the government. And so we took a long time trying to figure out, well, how would we do that? And we decided, based on, in part, an experience that I had doing the black sites, knowing that even if you're the CIA, you can put a cover up over things that you're trying to keep secret, but everything lives somewhere. It doesn't live in the clouds, it lives here on the earth. And so we said, well, what if we then did sort of a mapping of our own of what we came to call an alternative geography of the United States. It is sort of mapping the DNA of the secret world. And we started at the secret level on looking for units and organizations and companies that did work for the government at the secret level. So this is one kind of classification. And we found so many that we said, well, we're never going to be able to get through this, so let's elevate it to the top secret level, which is much more difficult because that is actually a huge leap.
But sorry to interrupt, but how do you even get the names of the companies and the organizations?
Well, it was, I'll tell you one fun story about that. I mean, some of them were a process of just taking the organizations that we knew. Bill is a self-described obsessive compulsive person who loves to look at budgets and lists, and so he routinely looks at the minutia of government that most people don't look at. And if there's an anomaly, he could spot it. And so he would trace it, he'd put a little card into his secret units box, and for years he would, go through and try to find these things. So I'll just give you one example. He had a name of an organization that he was convinced was a secret organization. And so I got the address, and I went to Crystal City where it was located, and we knew the street and the name and the floor it was located on because he had records of wiring contracts that would wire fiber optic cables from one office to another. And so he knew that there was a triangle of wires between this organization, a very secret organization in the Pentagon, and another building by the same organization in another place in Crystal City. So I went looking for it. We even knew what floor it was on. And went into a lobby. I was looking for the 15th floor, and the lobby had a directory that scrolled. It was an electronic one that scrolled the names of everything in the building. And it stopped on the 14th floor. And I was looking for the 15th floor. And so I went up, I got onto the elevator, and I saw that there was a 15th floor button, so I pushed it. And I went up and, ready for who knows what, but found a janitor instead, vacuuming the carpet. And went around the corner, and there was the door with the sign and the camera that, looked at you, and the warning signs to go away and all that. And then I did the same thing for another building, which was also in this triangle. And again, the marquee outside, this is an Air Force, mainly an Air Force building, had a lot of the names for different Air Force organizations, but nowhere was the Defense Policy Analysis Office. Again, it didn't exist. And so slowly we learned, if I went back to the Crystal City place that I had gone through many times reporting about the military, I now started looking at marquees. And they're these big giant buildings, like 15 stories tall, and they'd have nothing on the marquee except, Joe's Pizza Place, which was downstairs. And so I would feed him addresses. He would do his thing on, he knows deep web searching, which is something, everybody should learn how to do better. And with contracts, with paperwork, with a lot of interviews that I did with people that I'd either known for a long time in the intelligence world, you have to kind of accumulate sources over a long period of time, who pointed in other directions. We came up with, over 2 years' time, a map that actually pinpoints where it all is. And then we tried to figure out what all these things did, not in any real granular level, but what do they work on generally. And then you'll see on our website, which is WashingtonPost.com/Top Secret America, you can play around with the database that shows you how many things work on X, Y, and Z. And you'll see one of the big patterns that we found was redundancy, that this thing had not just grown, in fact, it had doubled in size in most places than prior to 9/11, but that the money was flowing so quickly that no one really paid much attention to where it was going. If you had an idea, you could get it funded, and therefore what developed is a huge redundancy in almost any place you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the patterns.
In fact, we
found.
may have a chart or two that ran with the story. If we could throw that up. I think they're kind of amazing. It shows, all right, there you are. Look at that, for a Rube Goldberg construction. And the idea behind the story, and why I described it as chilling, is there are so many agencies, and there's redundancy, compartmentalization, and everything, that no one can possibly get a handle on it. It's like drinking from a fire hose instead of a glass of water.
Well, General Clapper, who is now the Director of National Intelligence, he actually said that there is one person who knows it all, and that's God.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't created by God, though. Did you at any time, when you had to verify the information, I know you interviewed the Defense Secretary Gates, did anyone say, please don't publish this? Or please don't publish parts of it? And did you hold anything back?
Oh, we did.
Omit anything?
You have, in national security reporting, what you're balancing is things that really need to be kept secret, either because lives are at stake, an operation that's not controversial and clearly doesn't cross some line is at stake, and a whole other realm of things that really are described on a case-by-case basis and is hard to imagine unless you're getting into that realm. So in all cases where I have something that is obviously secret, the government feels that they make it secret, they classify it for a legitimate reason. That's what, again, that's what they are doing. They're trying to work to do it for a legitimate reason because it would damage national security is what the rules are. Then I always tell them what it is that we have, and so that they can make an argument that if you publish this, whatever argument they want to make. And in this case, they did make an argument that the number of details that we had would be damaging. And for us, and actually they said, don't publish it. And we said, well, we're going to publish it. Could you be a little more helpful and try to explain what your concerns are? And we didn't get very far.
And did you hold stuff out?
Well, we definitely held stuff out, but we did that because when we internally discussed, what it would be, we had some what I'd call consigliaries, people who are who've been in intelligence but are no longer there and also really value what the Post does, to talk through the various aspects and could we be setting people up for damaging, results that we didn't want to do. And what we always have to do is we walk as far up to the line of giving readers information that has detail to make the story authentic, because if you notice, there aren't very many people quoted in it. We walk up to that line without hopefully crossing it and damaging any national security things, but also not gratuitously putting details in that are in that category of classified. So, it's really what we're trying to do is to make our stories
credible. And you're
credible.
comfortable with it? You feel nothing in your articles really ended up being all that sensitive or or at least
I'm
not
sure
harmful?
that there was a big hoopla over it because, for one, it put all the names of the companies together. And the companies didn't like that, even though this is based on unclassified information, which is another interesting dynamic that we can hopefully talk about in WikiLeaks, is at the same time that they're classifying things, like ridiculous things in some cases, there is enormous amount of clues out there on the web and elsewhere that can lead you along a trail that we took. So the government has no idea what is out there to be had.
Yeah, they don't even know. Adam, in your documentary, you concentrated on a 31-year-old man, Henry Glover, what happened to him. Can you just tell us briefly his story and why you chose him to tell a larger story?
Yeah, so Henry Glover was 31-year-old man. He was a father of 4, and it was shortly after Hurricane Katrina. And what we understand is that he was going to get some goods that had been taken from a dime store. They were pots and pans and candles and stuff. And he was shot by a police officer near that dime store. He sought help. His brother and a Good Samaritan and another person rushed him for help. And one thing that didn't go in the documentary that's worth saying now is this was on the west bank of the Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina. So it didn't flood there, but there was no power, there was no water. The conditions were really rough. And it was within New Orleans proper. And the closest hospital was across the parish line in the next parish over. And there was a barricade there. And they couldn't get through because there was law enforcement, the sheriff's department set up there. So this was a group of 4 black men in a car, one of whom had just been shot. And the driver said, "We are 4 black men in a car. We are not going to get through into the largely white neighboring parish. And we're going to go to the closest place I think we can get help. And that is to this police encampment up the street at a school." They didn't realize that Henry had been shot by a police officer. And so they sped him to this SWAT team outpost. The SWAT team had taken over this elementary school. And they showed up there and they thought that, hey, these guys, they know CPR, they can rush him to the hospital, they can treat him here, they probably have medical supplies, they'll help him. But they didn't help him. What they did is they physically attacked the able-bodied men, the three able-bodied men, and they left Henry Glover to bleed to death in the back of the car. And then the officers took Henry's body and the car that the Good Samaritan had been driving. They drove it over behind another police outpost, a police station, parked it on the banks of the Mississippi River, set it on fire, burned up Henry's body, and left him there and pretended that he was a piece of rubbish, he was a piece of garbage, that he hadn't been a human, and that it didn't matter. And they covered it up for 3 years until I started poking into it. And Yeah,
When you poked into it, you were clearly running a risk. I noticed you even interviewed the deputy. I guess it was the deputy police commissioner. They must have known what you were looking into. Did you have any kind of frightening moments? Did you encounter hostility? How did you get people to open up, including his brother, who I think was one of the three, wasn't he?
Yeah, there's kind of two important things here. And one is first that like the bigger challenge, rather than like the awesome like action movie stuff, like getting threatened by cops, that kind of stuff. The bigger challenge, honestly, it was bureaucratic. And that's how these things often are, is that the secret agent here, the secret weapon, was our attorney. Every single piece of documentation that we wanted to get, we had to threaten to sue to get. So Lori Mintz, the attorney who worked with me on the TV and on the stories, the print stories, she was the one who did a lot of the hard work. They didn't want to give up anything from the coroner's office. We had to sue them to get the autopsy report.
Yeah, tell about what you were told when you went to the coroner's office.
So I called the coroner's office and I wanted to see the autopsies of people who had died violently after Hurricane Katrina. And I said, to the staff at the coroner's office, I said, would you like me to make a formal public records request? I know this is a public document under Louisiana law. And the staffer said, well, you can do that, but we don't follow the law anyway. So we sued and prevailed, but that was how everything was with the police records, with the coroner reports, with everything. The second piece about the sort of fear and of being menaced by the police, honestly, I was too naive to get it, like that I should be nervous. And I had uncovered conspiracies before. I had documented, done reporting that had shown that police had framed 2 innocent men for murder, sent them to prison for 14 years. They were exonerated. They were paid $7 million by the city. So I knew that these kind of things happened and that there were, in fact, times when people did incredibly damaging things and they conspired to do them and so forth. But I just didn't get it, honestly, for about 2 years of time in New Orleans. And I would meet I met with a source who said, I don't want anyone to know I'm meeting with you because the police will, if they find out, they'll end up doing something like planting 3 pounds of cocaine in my car. I thought, well, this person's crazy. This person's watched too much Training Day, too much Serpico. And then after I started interviewing a lot of cops who had actually done that, I realized, I should have been like, I was kind of naive. Like, this actually is how it goes down in New Orleans.
Yeah. In San Francisco also, you were attracted, you wrote often about police, about social injustice, housing projects. What drew you to this as a kind of specialty? Was there something in your background? Or why do you dig deeply into this one particular area?
Well, it's really this, and I've been thinking about it lately, and partially it was early on my mentoring with Sandy Close, an award winner here this year, that I'm interested in the stories of people from the ground up, and the stories of people at the bottom, and the stories of people who aren't being talked to by the media. And so that was the way I've approached all these stories. So my point of entry for doing the investigation into what happened with Henry Glover was really through his family. It wasn't through people at the top of the police department saying, oh, this horrible thing happened and no one's doing it. It was from the very people at the bottom that no one had talked to. And if anyone had just gone and spent time with them and listened to them, they would have seen this story. And that's kind of another kind of secrecy, that there are people that just are not listened to, that just don't get a chance to communicate their message. And that's what I've tried to do a lot with my
going to
reporting.
places where others don't, talking to people who usually aren't talked to. There's a whole nother world.
Exactly. Exactly.
Michael, speaking of starting at the top instead of the bottom, your piece on General McChrystal had obviously a huge impact, but I read somewhere that you were surprised by that. Did you not know what you had when you printed it? And I think you told Newsweek, I'm actually shocked by the response.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I was shocked by the response and still am, is that, I've been covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for 5 years, and usually no one cares about anything you write. And I'm not. I don't even mean that ironically. It's just like there's jaw-dropping stuff that comes out every week about what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan that leaves nary a dent in our public consciousness. So my thinking at the time was I knew it was good material, but my thinking was, well, maybe they'll talk about it on cable for a couple hours, and and then I'll go on my merry way and write a book about my time with a crazy general. So I was quite surprised by it. But I mean, I guess one of the sort of where I kind of am coming from on the story was that for years working for Newsweek and filing a lot of reports and covering the war in Iraq, what I realized what would happen often is that the most interesting parts, what I felt of my files and stories, were actually being taken out of what was getting published. And it wasn't that it was, the news was always there, but it was, the offhand comment, what people really say, how people really act, what it was really like to be there. These sort of details that I find really fascinating, but they would never really make it into...
Editors would cut them out, and you thought they were telling details.
And editors cut them out, and probably rightly so, just because they weren't necessarily, didn't fit in the medium that I was kind of writing for. When I decided to leave Newsweek, one of the things I wanted to do was capture all those details, and one of the first big stories I did was for GQ, where I went out to this outpost on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan with this group of 20 guys, and talk about people who no one ever listens to, the average soldier, the private and the specialist. He lives his life not being listened to, right? And all of a sudden, here's this dude who comes up, and he's like, oh, wait, your job is just to listen to all the complaints I have? and like, unlike my buddies who've heard them for like 2 years straight every day since basic training, it's all new to you? I'm like, yeah. And then you're gonna like put my picture in the magazine? Yeah. They're like, that's
But I have to say, there's a of good military reporting coming out of both Iraq and Afghanistan, in which reporters talk and live directly with the people during the fight. So it's not a unique thing.
No,
but just back to the general. Do you think he should have been fired?
Well, I'll get to my point is that outpost in Afghanistan, what I did with these guys was go on guard duty with them and listen to them talk for hours, right? And so the idea behind the story of General McChrystal that I always had was, well, no one's ever really hung out with these top-ranking guys and sort of told it like it was with them, and so that's what my sort of thinking. Should he have been fired? That was President Obama's decision, and my thinking was, well, I did the best story I could do, and let the chips fall where they may.
How did you manage to achieve this kind of fly-on-the-wall status? How did you get access?
Sure.
I know you've said the most surprising things happened right in the first 24 or 48 hours when you met them in Paris. How did you, in a way, get yourself into their confidence? And did you have to establish any ground rules at all?
I didn't have to establish any. I mean, in this case, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not that dramatic. I wanted to do a profile of General McChrystal for Rolling Stone. I emailed the press guy, said, hey, I'd love to do a profile of General McChrystal. He said, come to Paris next week. I said, okay. I showed up in Paris, and we sort of said, okay, and I said, here's the story. I'd love to do a story with like part of you guys hanging out in Paris, in Europe, and the other part in Kabul. And then, come on in, and I just sort of followed him around with a tape recorder and a notepad. And a lot of the stuff that ended up getting them, that became sort of controversial, was all said within the first 24, 48 hours. So much so that I knew I kind of already had my story, but then, the volcano went off in Iceland, and I kind of ended up getting stuck with them for longer, which was advantageous in the end because I got to really sense of who they were.
Yeah, I read it now in preparation for this a couple of, I'd say 4 or 5 times, and it's interesting. The quotes from McChrystal himself are not really that damning. There are 3 things he said, one about Biden, one about Eikenberry, one about not wanting to receive emails from Holbrooke.
So
But-
three of the four top
Yes.
most important people,
No,
civilians he trashed.
It gives you a sense. Well, I wouldn't say it was trashing, actually.
Well, I think
But
if
the damaging quotes came from people close to him and under him.
that's not true. That's actually not true. If you read the story, the most damning quote that's been quoted by everyone is Biden, Vice President Biden, bite me. That's the quote. And the reason that quote was said
it
was
wasn't
because
bite me that McChrystal said. He said, "Who's Biden?"
Right. But and this is the point that General McChrystal in that scenario was the first one who started making fun of Vice President Biden and let the door open for the comments to follow. So this idea that it was just his aide saying this stuff I don't think
didn't
it's true.
say that. I didn't say it was just his age. I said it's interesting that a lot of the materials seem to have come from people under him. I don't think that makes it invalid in any way. It may be even more valid. But many of them weren't quoted by name, so you must have said, I won't quote you on this, or this is off the record.
No, in
Or
fact,
did you never say those
we
words?
had their name. I had their names in the original draft, but my editors took them out for like readability reasons. And there were occasions when they did say stuff was off the record, and if I would have published that, that would have been a real story. But I stuck to, one of the sort of interesting aspects to the story, and going back, I have a book that's coming out about it, and I was going back and sort of listening to my first interviews with them, and my first interview with General McChrystal, I have it, it's this sort of really amazing moment on tape where the press advisor says, "Oh, Michael's going to be hanging out with us for the next couple of days in Paris." And General McChrystal says, "That's great." And then the press advisor goes, "Are there any questions he should ask the staff?" Which to me, which was the closest sort of moment of sort of establishing, some kind of framework for what story they were expecting.
Do you? I don't mean this to be a contentious question, but do you think? I mean, obviously, your piece has created some controversy among your colleagues. Do you think it is fair to hang out with somebody over a long period of time, or even a short period of time, and kind of, go drinking with them, listen to them?
I didn't drink with them.
Okay, go.
I don't.
Go to
I
a
don't
bar
drink,
in which
actually.
they're getting hammered. And
Have you read Rolling Stone?
yeah. No, and hang out with somebody and kind of hear their kind of off-the-cuff comments.
They weren't
And
off-the-cuff comments.
I'm not saying that they're
I'm going to
not
contest
valid.
every inaccurate thing you say, so let's just,
All right. Jokes. The jokes. And I'm not saying they're irrelevant jokes, but just comments, things people say. Banter.
Sure.
Banter among them. But let me finish. Do you think it's fair to take
I've heard this before, that's why I can sort of
and
know where
weave
you're
it
going.
into a kind of larger portrait?
Sure, I think the key in this sense was that these weren't just offhand comments. They were comments that got directly at the idea of civil-military relations. And the civil-military relationship is the key component to our counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. So when you had the top general of the war showing such disdain, and his staff, and the general was responsible for the command climate. When you had the top general of the war and his staff consistently making comments that were derogatory about the civilian leadership, whether they were justified or not to make those comments, that to me was clearly important, an important story to tell.
Okay. Wilbert, can you tell us this kind of quickly how journalism attracted you when you were in Angola, and what it meant to you and what it did for you?
I discovered when I got off death row, I discovered myself in, what was at that time the bloodiest prison in the United States. And I saw things that were just absolutely horrific. I had never, been in a world like this before. And I just couldn't believe that people knew what was going on. They couldn't know. The rest of society couldn't know, because if they did know, I don't think they'd go for what was going on. And, you know, you send people to prison, yes, to be punished, but not what's taking place in the prison. And by then I had decided I wanted to be a writer, so I decided I would try telling what was going on. And I wrote newspapers and asked for a forum, and the only one that answered me back was a chain of black weeklies for Louisiana and Mississippi who said, hey, we'd like to have a weekly column from you called The Jungle. And because that's where I saw the prison, a jungle. And I started writing a weekly column. I didn't know who was reading me. As it turned out, several years later, a brand new director of corrections came in, and he had been reading me, and he liked what he read. And he felt that I wanted to tell the truth about what was going on, so he also felt that a big problem in prison and the misconceptions that both the keeper and the kept had about each other, and the reason they were so ready to believe the worst of each other was because of the way they perceived each other. And he felt that a free press, you know, the press plays this role out in the streets in the free world. It educates people about people, you know, both sides, everybody. And he felt that if you could transfer this, if you could pass you see, in the past, information was passed through a prison grapevine. And if you could just transfer that over to a legitimate forum, and that's a free press, then it would, you know, maybe it could change things. And he asked if I'd do it, and I told him only if it wasn't censored. And he surprised the hell out of me by just saying, okay. You know, you have to understand, censorship has been a religion that's been practiced universally in America's prisons forever. And this was the first time, and that's the way it happened. He just said, okay. You know, and we shook hands on it, but there was a condition. We were given the power to investigate, photograph, anything we could substantiate, and publish any story, just so long as it's the truth. And if we didn't know the truth, at least make an honest effort to find out what the truth is. And his thinking was that, you know, the prison was so horrific. What are you hiding it for? You know, if the public knew the truth, perhaps they would be moved to change things. And that was the whole gist of it.
And do you find it did help bridge the gap between those who were being kept and those who were doing the keeping?
It did.
Yeah.
They got to understand each other, because what we did is we wrote about both sides. We covered it like a community, the same way the Washington Post covers Washington, D.C., and everything goes on. That's what we did. And we tried to be a very real publication, even though we were all self-taught journalists. We didn't know what we were doing. But we had an idea by, you know, you read other publications, you see what they do, and okay, let's try to do the same thing. And that's the way we did it. And we thought we were doing pretty good. And
well,
then,
you certainly had a number of major stories about, you know, sex slaves, about the defective electric chair that was burning people.
Well, the defective electric chair, we did that because we discovered there were some photographs, and when I discovered about the photographs, I realized that they were in court, and none of the other news media would publish it. And I mean, the most effective way to do this is, you know, if you're gonna do something, you ought to be able to at least look at what you do. If you can't look at it, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. So we published them. We got the pictures, and we published the pictures. And
what was the reaction among the other inmates, the other prisoners, especially, say, to the story about sex?
On sex, most of the prisoners, as a rule, whether they engaged in it or in sexual violence or if they didn't, they did not like the story because they didn't want people, their friends and relatives in the outside world, to think that they had anything to do with this kind of stuff that was going on. Because understand, what we did, at that time, prison authorities nationwide used to portray sexual violence as isolated incidents, and they were done by gay inmates or, widows. And the reality was, heterosexuals were doing this. And the gay inmates quite often were victims. And it was done with the tacit approval of the administration, although they would say, hey, we've got nothing to do with it. We can't control this. Well, they were doing it. And because it divided the inmates. As long as you've got one segment of the inmate population controlling the other, and they're slaves, well, it makes the prison a whole lot easier to run. And we were able to get, because of this director of corrections who ordered everybody to answer questions whenever we asked them about their job, they had to tell the truth. If I wanted to see a receipt, they had to let me see it. But no personal stuff, just as long as it's business.
Did you have to run the stories by anyone, by the warden, before printing them?
We had to run it through Peggy Gresham. She was our supervisor at the time. And she was the assistant to the warden because the warden didn't have time to deal with that. So she read it. And all she wanted, in fact, she went back to school and took a 6 month, I think, studied journalism just to see what it's about, to be a more effective supervisor, because she knew what the director wanted. He wanted a very real publication, just like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and any other. And he took pride in it, especially after we started winning awards. But, but the thing is, we were able, in the sexual violence thing, is that we were able to get officials from the wardens, chief of security, everybody to admit what they were doing. They admitted that it goes on. Yes, they do have these accommodations. Yes, security forces do this. And they admitted. That's the first time that an administration just admitted that happened. In fact, they reported that at the next American Correctional Convention, they were boycotted by some of the other correctional administrators because they couldn't understand why they let that cat out of the bag.
Let me ask just quickly each one of you about the impact of your stories. Dana, do you think the black sites, which created a huge furor when that story was printed, still exist?
No. Obama ordered the last ones. Well, actually, Bush ordered the last one, except he ordered all the prisoners sent to Guantanamo. There were 14 of them that were still left in the black sites by the time he did that, which was about a year after the stories ran. And then he closed the final one after Obama became president. They closed the final one, which was in Afghanistan. So there are no black sites. And then they've led to a number of investigations on Capitol Hill, which is a little ironic because some of those people that were calling for investigations knew what was happening. But when the Democrats had little power at the time the stories were published, they said very little. And when they became the majority, then they started using it for political advantage. And really that's when things started happening. Although overseas in Europe, they immediately had many investigations. Every country in Europe was required almost by their population to investigate and to say whether they had a secret prison. And of course, the way that these were arranged were with the heads of intelligence agencies or the presidents, who usually were no longer in power. So the governments have all denied that they had any prisons where they had them. However, there are plane records that show the planes landed in certain places, and so there's a belief about where they were.
But things have, your articles definitely changed the entire setup.
Right. In this case, I think it's more of a diffuse issue, because we're dealing with the whole system. There have been a number of investigations launched, and Gates has said that he wants to review all intelligence programs to cut out redundancy. I think it is something that's moving, but it's at a slower pace because, again, there are 18 agencies. They're all separate and independent. The budgeting process is what it is. Congress has a lot of vested interest in not changing things. And who wants to ever say we're not spending enough on counterterrorism?
Yeah. Adam, as the New Orleans Police Department, you think changed in any significant way as a result of
Yeah, a
the
lot
front
of them are
line?
going to prison.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just last
yeah.
week,
Yeah,
the man
yeah.
who shot Henry.
Yeah, I would say that's changed. Since I started this cycle of reporting in 2007, 8 people have been indicted as a result of the reporting. So there was one person who was a civilian who was indicted on hate crimes charges for shooting an African-American man in the face, allegedly because of his race. Then there were 2 officers indicted for lying about their shooting of a man in the back after Hurricane Katrina. He died. And then there were the 5 officers who were indicted in connection to killing Henry Glover. And like you said, one of them got 25 years, another one got 17 years, a third is awaiting sentencing, and 2 of them were acquitted. But more broadly, you know, what I've thought about doing these stories over the last 10 years is that those things help to reform institutions. Sending people to prison for killing citizens, that helps reform them. It doesn't do enough, though. It's the beginning of that process. And the kind of broader process is underway in New Orleans in that the federal government, the Justice Department, started a civil side investigation of the police department. They started saying, well, hey, we want to go beyond just, you know, charging people in these individual cases. And they released a 158-page report of their findings documenting systemic, ongoing civil rights violations by the department. What is likely to happen is the Department of Justice will go into court with the police department. They will get a consent decree that will lead to a judge monitoring the department over 3 or 5 or an unlimited number of years. And there will probably be a 30 to 50 point check that will be, hey, these are the things you need to improve in the department. Citizen complaints, so citizens can actually complain and have their complaints heard. Internal affairs, so that officers actually effectively investigate misconduct by other officers. Use of force, so that people aren't getting shot in the back unnecessarily. And that process is likely to go on for years, but it has the possibility of dramatically transforming the department in a way that goes beyond just sending a handful of officers to prison.
Michael, you've been back to Iraq since your article. Do you think there's been any shift or change in that relationship between the civilian elected leaders and the people actually running the war, in which the power had gravitated or maybe even was taken by the military ones? And also any change in, you emphasized this very important strategic policy in which they tried to minimize civilian casualties that made soldiers feel they were more at risk. Has there been a change in that with a change in command, or is the military just such a large, spreading organization that it doesn't change very easily?
Well, I think there's still pretty significant problems, civil military problems, and we're going to see that play out in the next few months as the White House tries to push for a drawdown of American troops on the July 2011 deadline, and General Petraeus and the Pentagon is going to really try to resist that. In terms of the civilian casualties issue, airstrikes are up, so that's pretty significant. Night raids are up. These are all incidents that would tend to lead to more civilian casualties. And there was also an incident where a whole town was wiped out, and then we're now rebuilding it. There were no casualties there, but clearly, I think though they say there's no difference in the rules of engagement, there actually has been a loosening of them.
Dan, in your piece you said there were 854,000 people who have top secret clearance. That does not even include a previously obscure private Bradley Manning, who I think only had clearance for classified information. There must be over 1 million people then who have that. How, if there's so many people who have access to classified or top secret information, if it's so widely disseminated, how can you keep it secret? And should you keep it secret?
Well, there are secrets that I think should be secret. I mean, I'll give you one example: nuclear codes. You know, how you make a nuclear weapon viable, and many others. I mean, I would never argue that there aren't, but every panel, every body that's ever looked at classification issues in a systematic way has always said things are overclassified. And the incentive is to classify something, that's the safe way. And why risk not doing enough? Let's do too much. So, that is one, that's one issue. There's pretty draconian methods for keeping people having clearances. I mean, they do background checks. They get very personal if you're at a top secret level. They have a secret court that rules on these issues. You don't have as many rights as you would in a normal court. And because there's an economic incentive to keep your clearance, because you can make so much more money in the private sector with a clearance, people are pretty careful. However, it's this other thing that is happening. These two things are happening in parallel. One is the government is classifying, as it has been for years, over-classifying things, and then hiding them in separate compartments that get cut up into into layers of secrecy, and that's one big problem we found. On the other hand, because of technology and social media and what you can do with a computer, you have WikiLeaks. And I don't think that is going to necessarily stop, because there are many ways to penetrate systems that are supposed to be secure. And as this episode has shown also, and people said, well, why would Private Manning have access to those cables? I think it's a pretty darn good question. I mean, I don't at all, I support I have big problems with Julian Assange and his personality, but the information that has come out in the WikiLeaks cables is fascinating. It's important. By and large, shows the government doing things, I think, in the right way versus the wrong way.
And it's had tremendous international
and it's
impacts,
had tremendous international
ranging
effect.
from Tunisia and Ben Ali
Right,
to
and I think that's
Yemen.
also where, if our foreign policy rests on falsehoods to the public and secrecy with dictators, it's going to be vulnerable.
But how about this notion that diplomats should have a right to cable back home what they think of a leader, or to point out the leader's family is corrupt? What do you think, Adam? Do you think Julian Assange, who describes himself as a reporter, is in fact functioning as a reporter? Do you think what he did was heroic, valuable, deplorable?
Well, that's a lot of questions. Oh, here, the first thing is that I think, wow, to me, I see the parallels between the cables that we learned about from the Church Commission hearings back in the 70s. They're not dramatic like those, like, hey, let's topple the Allende government. But it's interesting that, 40 years later, we have these same sort of revelations coming from that communications mode. Do I think what he did was heroic? I don't know that most things are heroic, but I think it's very interesting. I think it's had this incredible impact on our sphere. I think for journalists, in one way, the important thing that it's done is it's made the idea of journalism, the concept of journalism, interesting to people beyond our circles. That people started talking about journalism again. They started talking about important stories because of that. And I think that is weirdly an interesting, an important impact that he's had, that's had. Is he a journalist or not? I think that he's a person who's found a way to get very useful information out of a specific target group. And part of his target group are other hacker type computer expert nerds who have access to this information. And those are not often people that we as journalists think about cultivating as sources. You know, and that's kind of a genius move, frankly.
Yeah. Can I read a comment that from a column Bill Keller wrote last week in the Sunday Times magazine that gives a sense of this new world we've entered? It says, "The digital age has changed the dynamics of disobedience in at least one respect. It used to be that someone who wanted to cheat on his vow of secrecy had to work at it. Daniel Ellsberg tried for a year to make the Pentagon Papers public. There was a lot of time to have second thoughts or to get caught. It is now at least theoretically possible for a whistleblower or a traitor to act almost immediately and anonymously. Click on a website, upload a file, go home and wait." What do you think, Michael, about the whole WikiLeaks business? Has it changed journalism forever, or is that an area, do you think, getting into computers is something that journalists should know more about and begin to cultivate?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of Mr. Keller's description of that, I don't actually think that's accurate in terms of what Bradley Manning actually did, which was over a period of time. You know, he had speaking of Lady Gaga, it was Bradley Manning's Lady Gaga CD that he popped in to download these files, at great risk to himself, being where he was in Iraq.
I don't think he was describing, he's saying, I see a world now in which this kind of thing can happen.
Yeah, and I think in terms of does the internet, look, there's so much data on the internet that's so vulnerable. I mean, one of the interesting things, this group called Anonymous, who are a bunch of hacktivists, who are the defenders of WikiLeaks, hacked into this email account of this contracting agency and found tons of incredible material. So does it change journalism? I'm very wary of any sort of pronouncements about, the future of journalism has changed. It's just another way to get more information. And one of the funny things in a lot of the blog posts, it always say, WikiLeaks now fulfills the watchdog function that traditional media has failed to do. But then they'll put the exception, except for Dana Priest at the Washington Post, who does a great job of the watchdog stuff. But I think it's quite interesting that clearly what Assange has done is fulfilled a great need of this idea to sort of pierce through the secrecy in a way that no one else has been able to do.
Well, I think we're approaching question time, so if you do have a question, come down to either side of the aisle, line up in front of the mic. Meanwhile, I'll just ask quickly, have you faced reprisals for anything you've written or threats? I know you had some problems, I think, after the Black Sites prison.
Yeah, after the Black Site stories, the House and Senate leaders called for an investigation, not of the Black Sites, but of the Washington Post, and their surrogates went on TV. I mean, remember, this was a different time, and their surrogates went on television and called for the same thing and worse, and it did create a real hostility. I mean, I got bad emails. I got emails that weren't civil. I got emails that were threatening, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Michael, did you encounter a lot of, I don't know, complaints, gripes, threats?
It's interesting. I mean, one of the sort of interesting aspects to the story, and you touched upon it in your question. I mean, in the sort of questioning period here, I was the only one who asked, should you have reported the story? That was the question you sort of posed to me, and that was a response that a number of other journalists had as well. And to me, what it illuminated was this sort of extremely cozy relationship that many in my profession have established with very powerful figures, and how much they cherish that relationship, and the idea that anyone could threaten that, causes great concern. So the most sort of vicious kind of attacks I always get are from my colleagues.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons why I think it's somewhat ridiculous, some of the criticism is that basically the criticism is, wait, this guy wrote down what he heard and saw. Wait a minute, we're not supposed to do that. Literally, those are almost direct quotes from what people were saying. And as I said, this is sort of a theme that's now been, if General McChrystal was not a powerful person, if he was a leader of a gang and I wrote down what he said, no one would have been on CNN saying, "Hey, wait, was that off the record?" I mean, so that's what I just say about that.
Have you faced difficulties because of what you've written or
Yeah,
had on TV?
there were a couple dicey moments in New Orleans when we were doing the hate crime story. We made contact with somebody in the neighborhood where the hate crimes had occurred and allegedly occurred, and this person said, don't come here. We know who you are. We know who did these shootings. We don't have a problem with it. If you come over here, expect that your life is in serious jeopardy. So there's
And did you go over there?
Oh, yeah. Look, reporting in America, like being a cab driver is a much more dangerous profession than being a journalist. And so you get those things, but I don't take them that seriously. It's more dangerous to do a lot of other things, much more dangerous.
Like be a journalist in
Wilbur,
Colombia.
did you, in Angola, were you ever threatened for
the difference
anything?
between what he was doing and what we were doing is that, they would write him a letter to the editor about his stories.
Yeah.
They didn't exactly write letters to the editor where I read. They might show up at your door with a baseball bat. But no, we did. I mean, there are times you go on high alert. You know that what you're gonna, you get a feel for what the tolerance level of people you write who are reading it, and you know that, hey, this is gonna mess up some heads and some insecurity, or this is gonna mess up a certain gangster's head. But it's like you can't function intimidated. Certainly not in a prison. I mean, you can function intimidated out here, but not in a prison. Yeah. It'll eat you alive.
Sir, you have a question?
I just want to say that I think Michael has given a good account of himself as, in fact, following a certain number of rules. Like, for example, he has said that he didn't write down off the cuff comments or some rule of that kind. I was wondering, when it comes down to the bottom line, what kind of ground rules, Michael, are you stating for your hanging out with McChrystal? Mm-hmm. And was it his fault, perhaps, that he didn't follow these ground rules that you have in mind? If he'd expected to be fired, if you'd shown him what you were going to write, he would have tried to withdraw it, wouldn't he? Or perhaps he might have felt that you didn't warn him that you were going to put all this stuff down and somehow get it out.
Sure. Well, I guess, thank you for the question. I guess I would say that there's I'm not trying to be a smartass here, though it takes effort for me sometimes. I apologize for that. There's 4 decades worth at least of what a magazine profile looks like. And when a public figure invites a magazine journalist to tag along with them, even if it's just for an hour or if it's for 2 days or if it's for a month, I would suggest that a good rule of thumb is your expectation of privacy is much diminished. And in fact, things that you say to the journalist that he writes down might end up in print. And it's actually an interesting question. What did they expect of the story? And I don't know what exactly they sort of expected. But I think it was a double-edged sword because they were performing for the audience of Rolling Stone in a way too. I think this is what I've always sort of thought, and they knew what sort of made a good Rolling Stone story. So this idea of them, partying in Paris or hanging out and being these kind of macho, super talented, brilliant guys that they are. I always thought that was part of it. That part of it was for they were sort of. It was the light sort of shining
playing to
on.
an expected
Yeah.
audience.
And I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to see what they end up will end up saying. I haven't talked to them because General McChrystal hasn't sort of publicly commented on the story except for his initial apology for it.
This whole issue, I just want to interject, of profiles and what you reveal and don't reveal has been discussed for years and years. Some of you may remember 1989 article by Janet Malcolm called "The Journalist and the Murderer," in which she wrote about Joe McGinnis, who began a book on a man named Jeffrey MacDonald, telling MacDonald that he believed he was innocent, and thereby gaining access to some private papers. And then when the book came out, it was a kind of strong case for his conviction. If I remember the first sentence of the article, it is a shocking opening, but it says, "Any journalist who is not a fool or not so full of himself that he doesn't know what is going on will admit that what he does is morally indefensible." That's quite a sweeping indictment of the field. But it created a furor because there are sometimes little betrayals that go on in any profile writing. That is to say, you don't always open up and tell the person what you're expecting to, and you're looking for things. I mean, it's a natural
But on the
way
other
to do
hand,
it.
it's not up to the journalist to narrow their own field of what's permissible to write. It's up to the subject to set the ground rules if they want to limit what is on or off or on background. Why would a journalist handcuff themselves?
Unless, of course, the subject, and it's not the case here, or in the case, I think, with probably Janet Malcolm's subject, if it's somebody who doesn't know much about journalism, somebody from
Right.
the streets who's being interviewed, I think
That's a different subject.
journalists are under an
I do
obligation to
too.
be very
But
careful.
if you're in the public eye,
Yeah.
you have a staff of public affairs people, it is their responsibility to set and maintain, in one sense, the ground rules.
and you've risen up to the highest level
Right.
of command. It's kind of strange you don't. Sir.
Hi. I'm glad you mentioned that taxi driving is more dangerous than journalism, because I wanted to ask a question about a journalist who was a taxi driver and a muckraking journalist at the same time and is now on death row, Mumia Abu-Jamal. I want to ask something, especially Mr. Rideau, but all of you, if you feel any connection with him, and as the community of journalists, if you feel any passion about his plight. It's also connected to Bradley Manning for me, who's a whistleblower who's now in prison, and there's a lot of being written about his rights being violated, as well as Mumia Abu-Jamal's rights.
Do you want to handle that?
Well, I don't mind. The only thing, I mean, I don't know that much about Jamal's case, unfortunately. You know, there are a lot of people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, and I don't know all their case. Some of them are famous, and I still don't know them. But you know, I think what you're saying is like, you know, there's a fellowship or community of journalists or something, and is there feelings about, I don't know, you know, as I attempt to try to answer your question, I don't know how to answer your question. I am concerned that, you know, if I don't know his case well enough to know whether or not he's been treated fairly or unfairly. I don't know much about it.
I think there's an argument to me. Sorry.
No, anyone want to add to
My hope is that he would be treated fairly, because I know what it's like not to be treated fairly.
What did you read?
The McClatchy newspaper just wrote a great editorial about Bradley Manning, saying that media outlets should actually chip in for his defense too, and not just the defense of WikiLeaks if the government decided to prosecute a case. And I think there's a compelling argument to be made that to see, you know, if he is the great one of the sort of great sources of journalistic history, where newspapers and magazines use his stuff all the time, the stuff that he leaked all the time, I think there's something to be said to advocate on his behalf so he doesn't spend the rest of his life in jail.
This is probably mostly for Michael, but I throw it out for the rest of the panel too. What do you think the legacy of the Pat Tillman case is for journalists and also for the country?
I think the legacy, in my speaking personally, what Pat Tillman's family did to uncover the truth was incredible, gut-wrenching. I don't know how they did it and kept at it for so long, so that's just sort of my personal feeling about it.
clearly there's always going to be, the Pentagon's always going to want to spin the hero myth right away, and I think it always makes sense to sort of step back from that. But to me, the legacy is the fact that his family has been able to tell his story so grippingly and compellingly and keep it in the public's mind.
And it's also a good tale or a good reminder of how institutions are self-protective, and that, you know, it takes work to get sunshine on the facts. That they're by nature like that. That's why, you know, we have protections, because, you know, the founders figured that out a long time ago and set it up that way so that we could keep poking at the government.
Are you waiting to? Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
I have a couple of quick questions for Dana. To what extent do you think this internal security-intelligence apparatus that you uncovered is directed outward towards enemies foreign, and to what extent is it directed inward? And how do you see that trending? And also, to what extent do you believe these various government and corporate agencies operate through soft power, like disinformation and misinformation, using their connections? And to what extent do they operate through hard power, like making people disappear and extraordinary rendition and things like that? And how do you see that trending?
Okay. Well, because the Defense Department is the largest, by far the largest of all of the intelligence agencies, they really are directed outward. And so even we've looked at their presence in the United States, and they have a bigger mission now in the United States because of the Northern Command, but it's not really very interesting. So most of it is directed outward. However, and this was the fourth article that I did was on the domestic situation, and I looked at the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and some other things, and really there is a incremental, creeping trend towards putting things about you in a database because you might have done something that some local police officer, some shopkeeper, some person walking on the street might have thought looked suspicious. They could get you into a database that you won't have the right to know about. It's called the FBI's Guardian database. And because of technology, I mean, commercially available, I know this because I asked my researcher to do this. We have this commercially available technology that allows us, I mean, I can find anybody's Social Security in here. I can find out probably what credit cards you have, where you've lived since you were 18. It's all there. And the companies, they can find out your spending habits, an awful lot about you. Well, all of that now is available to the police too, to the FBI. So because of commercial trends and because of this dragnet approach is how I view it, is that they are, this whole report suspicious activities campaign, it's really a dragnet approach to send everybody out there, cast a big net, see if there's any interesting fish that come along, and the ones that they don't really know about, they'll put them in the database anyway in case they can find something down the road. Instead of using what has worked out a little bit better is FBI-focused counterterrorism investigations with some help from others. So that's the first one. And the second one, I don't remember. What is your Oh, soft and hard power. I believe that most of these agencies operate not in any rogue manner. They operate under the rules that they are passed by lawyers in various ways. I mean, the extraordinary renditions of secret prisons, they were all signed off on by the Office of Legal Counsel and the General Counsels at the CIA. So they were all approved. So I don't believe that people in the United States disappear, and that, I'm not a believer in conspiracy theories because the government's, in general, except I hear, oh my God, in general, too bollocksed up to sort of complete a conspiracy. But they're not very good at using soft power, especially when it comes to counterterrorism, where you see the military again is the big player there, and they're not And they're not equipped or trained to use soft power, and the institutions that are, the State Department being an AID, which is completely atrophied into a contract agency, they are bad at it and under-resourced, and there's no hope in the future, I don't think, that they're going to get any better because they have no constituency in Congress and little of it in the United States, unfortunately.
Michael, Joshua Coors, The Nation magazine. I appreciate your energy and your reporting. And I wanted to ask you about your position as a freelancer. In the past year, I uncovered some pretty grave crimes committed by top officials in the U.S. Army, and I presented those to producers at the major networks. All of them said to me, you know, this is really important. We have no doubt that this is true. We're not going to run this story. And one of them put it to me very bluntly. He said, look, we're not Michael Hastings. We have a relationship with the top officials at the Pentagon. Revealing these crimes would irrevocably damage that relationship. Michael can come, report the truth, and disappear. We can't do that.
Is there a question?
The question is, do you believe that that's true?
Well, I mean, I think. Well, thanks for your kind words, and also I get The Nation on my Kindle all the time, so I'll be looking for your byline, or once a week, not all the time. Whatever your story you have, shoot me an email. We'll talk to my editors at Rolling Stone. And no, I think, look, Rolling Stone has, they've been, in my view, they've been doing great stuff with Matt Taibbi, Tim Dickinson, and a number of other journalists I could list off. And one of their functions is to not have to worry about things like that. Like we're able to go there because we don't have a table at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, you know. But I think also one of the things is that I talk to people at the Pentagon all the time still, you know, and they talk to me not sometimes because they want to, not because they like me or like my socks, you know. They talk to me because they know it's in their interest to say, okay, we better, it's that Hastings guy, we better, you know, respond to his email, even if it's just to tell him to go have a nice day. So I think my experience has been, you know, you can do these stories and it's not, and in fact, it has more benefits than drawbacks.
We have time probably for only one or two more. Yes.
Hi. Just a few simple questions. Do you believe journalists are responsible chiefly to the public, government, or personal interest when investigating? And what are the risks that journalism take in revealing a story? To anybody who is willing to answer.
What's the
I
last one?
couldn't hear the second question.
What are the risks that are taken when you reveal a story?
Well, I think we've covered that second one pretty much. The
first
threats
one,
and
yeah.
things like that. And the first question again is?
Do you chiefly report, when you report and investigate, is it to the public, government, or your personal interests?
In following up various stories, I guess?
I report to my boss. You know, he signs
The
my
stories,
check.
I mean, when you investigate on the stories, who do you?
You know,
Is it chiefly you believe that it's to the public, to the government, or because you're interested in investigating these stories?
No, it's both. It's the stories that compel me that I feel like are worth working with my team, working with my colleagues, going after for years to get. And it's stories that I think matter, that are going to have some impact in the world, and that's why I want to do them. And occasionally they end up being like Aliens 1 in space. No one can hear you scream, and nobody actually cares about your story. But it's great when they do, and that's why I want to do that, is for the broader public.
Wilbur, what would you say your motivation was? Can you try and explain that?
When I was
When you were doing all these incredible stories.
my
at
motive
the end.
was to try to. I was all about trying to make a difference. You know, I mean, you know, it's not that many people get opportunity in life to have the power
Right.
to really make a difference for good. I mean, and to see the changes. I mean, in prison, being editor and and I can just pick out whichever. I know what a problem is. Quite often, I knew what the story was before you even start investigating it, and I know what the outcome is going to be. And you just pick one, and for the same reason he says, the one that excites you the most, and the one that will have the greatest impact and will make the biggest difference. And you also, the other thing you have to always, after you do all that, you figure out, okay, can you stand the heat? Will it bring you down? Most often, well, I say most often, it never brought us down. We were always able to stand the heat. But that was it. It's just, it's a great feeling, when you can do something. And, the thing I always loved is when I finished the story, the greatest compliment you could tell me is simply say, man, look, I didn't agree with you, but I didn't know that. That's all I wanted to hear. Just tell me you didn't know it, because I've done my job.
Last question.
So I apologize, this is also for Mr. Hastings. You mentioned earlier that your story exposed the contempt for civilians in the military's top brass. Well, isn't that a bit redundant in the sense that when you wage a war, it already shows contempt for civilians? I apologize if that's a bit rhetorical, but my second part of the question is, do you get the sense, covering the war in Afghanistan and the wars in Iraq, and how these guys are perpetually dragging their foot when people call for a deadline to end this war, and you mentioned that they're still continuing these night raids, continuing airstrikes. Do you think that there's a sense that they want the public in America, and perhaps even the public in these occupied countries, to get used to the idea of civilian deaths?
Well, in terms of the sort of the question sort of asking about kind of what does it mean to be kind of at war for the last decade, and then recently, a recent excursion in Libya as well. And I think whether it's intentional or not, I think it's clear that we as the public, me as a human being and a journalist, we get immune to what happens to civilians' death, especially when it happens in another country. So, but I don't know. I don't know if that's the intent, but that's certainly the consequence. Where I mean, and one of the sort of weird ironies was that you can write a story. I mean, Rolling Stone did a story last week about the kill team, which had these really horrific photos about this unit of American soldiers that had gone out and killed innocent civilians and set them up and did really, really horrific stuff. And it captured the news cycle for about 48 hours, But it's really, it is one of those rare issues where I actually agree with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who said just yesterday that story should have been much bigger than Abu Ghraib. And why wasn't it? And something screwed up when Rumsfeld is also reading Rolling Stone. But there's something to that, and I'm sure I actually would be curious to hear what the other panelists have to say in terms of have we gotten desensitized to some of this news that, I mean, Top Secret America, incredible jaw-dropping insights, and we almost don't even know how to
Right.
Interpret it.
Well, I think it's much easier to focus attention on a single thing, like in your case, a person. In the Walter Reed case, when we did the stories about the bad conditions there, I mean, that's one institution. So people know how to respond. But when you're talking about large things like war and systems, it's very difficult to respond. The Rolling Stone story about the kill teams, I think what that is reader fatigue. And you always face it as a journalist. I mean, first you face editor fatigue. So you're going to do one more story about what, you know? And I mean, that's why we don't have, I think, we have a lack of imagination about reporting on poverty here,
Right.
the economic downturn and what that did to people. I mean, our editors wanted those stories. On the other hand, what they didn't want, and I don't think you want either, is a story where you start to read the first paragraph and you kind of know what the story is going to say. I'm not saying that's what the Kill Team stories were like, but that calls upon, I think that makes a great case for the new platforms that we have at our fingertips, but are still not really using to their full extent, because you can combine the written word with voices, with video, and make something all more powerful and seem new, because, you know, every incident actually is new for those involved.
Great.
Just,
Well,
sorry, one more question, please. Consider me one of the panelists. I'm pretending I'm actually pushing. Forget to get
Go
a
for
story.
it.
So the panel will understand.
Go for it.
Well, in my opinion, the two venoms to print, and that is aggregators and the internet. And since print relies excessively or heavily on ad, do your investigative reports conflict with sponsors?
We had an interesting case in Top Secret America. First of all, no, they don't. I mean, we're separate, you know, so if there's someone in the advertising department who doesn't, I mean, they never discuss anything with the newsroom about what they should or shouldn't be doing because it might lose or gain ads. In fact, they make a point, if there's a story about, you know, a car, like, if there's a story that criticizes or glorifies something, they will not put an ad that's in the related field next to it. And the same thing happened with the Top Secret America. They decided on the website that they would have no ads for the first month, I think it was. Just, I don't know, in readers' minds, sometimes we don't do a good job of explaining ourselves, you know, explaining those kind of things, explaining that the editorial page is not the same as the news page, it's church and state, we don't talk to each other, they obviously don't read our paper sometimes, if they wouldn't take the positions they do, but...
Yeah, a long time ago, an editor told me, no one's ever going to buy an ad to put next to one of your stories. It was kind of telling.
Well, I would like to thank our panel. I think it was very interesting.
Thanks
Thank
lots.
you very
Appreciate
much.
it. Thank you.